My son texted, "Mom, don't come. My in-laws don't want you here." So I made a call. My son texted me exactly 1 hour before the event. The message read, "Mom, do not come tonight. Savannah's parents do not want you there, and we cannot afford any of your usual scenes. Please just stay home." I was standing in front of my custom floor-to-ceiling mirror when my screen lit up with those words. My bespoke emerald green gown was already perfectly zipped. My hair was flawlessly styled. Sitting on the pristine white duvet of my bed was a velvet box containing a $25,000 vintage Patek Philippe watch. I had spent 6 months tracking down that specific watch because Kendrick had mentioned it in passing. It was my gift to him and his wife for their 10th wedding anniversary. A lavish, no-expense-spared party at the Buckhead Country Club that I had paid $150,000 in cash to host. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone. I did not cry. I did not throw things or scream. At 68 years old, after spending 4 decades building a multi-million-dollar organic hair care manufacturing empire from a single rusty delivery truck in Atlanta, tears were a luxury I learned I could not afford. I just picked up my phone and made one call that left everyone absolutely stunned. I am Josephine, 68 years old, and somehow still healing from the deep, jagged wounds my own family inflicted on me. As a successful business owner, I thought my wealth would protect my family from the struggles I faced, but it only bred a different kind of monster. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth and tried to push you into the shadows. Now back to my story. I did not call my son back to argue with him. Arguing with Kendrick when he was trying to impress his high society in-laws was a losing battle. Savannah's family, the Vances, were old Atlanta money. They prided themselves on their generations of country club memberships and their political connections. They looked down on me because my hands used to be stained with essential oils and shea butter, because I built my fortune selling products out of the trunk of a car before I bought my first commercial warehouse. They thought my loud laugh was unrefined. They thought my presence was a liability, and apparently my son had finally decided to agree with them. But instead of crying in my bedroom, I turned around, picked up my phone, and walked out of my master suite. I descended the sweeping mahogany staircase of my estate, the sharp click of my heels echoing off the high ceilings. I headed straight for the kitchen, where my 21-year-old grandson Dante was sitting at the massive marble island. Dante was the family outcast, though, for completely different reasons than me. He was a senior cybersecurity major at Georgia Tech. To his father, Kendrick, and his snobbish mother, Savannah, Dante was just a massive disappointment who refused to go to law school and instead played on computers all day. They constantly belittled him, telling him he lacked ambition. They had absolutely no idea what those fingers could do across a keyboard. They did not know that the quiet kid with the noise-canceling headphones was a digital phantom. I walked up behind him and placed my phone on the marble counter right next to his coffee mug. "He sent it," I said quietly. Dante did not even flinch. He did not look up from the 3 glowing laptop screens he had set up across my kitchen island. The screens were filled with cascading lines of code financial spreadsheets and intercepted email servers. "I see it," Grandma Dante said, his voice tight and thick with an anger that matched my own. "And I promise you it gets so much worse. I just finished cracking the offshore accounts that Savannah's father set up. Tonight is not just an anniversary party, Grandma." I frowned, stepping closer to look at the documents illuminating his screens. "What do you mean it is not an anniversary party? I paid for an anniversary gala. I hired the caterers. I booked the jazz band." Dante shook his head, his fingers flying rapidly across the keys to open a new window. "It is a cover," he explained, pulling up a confidential press release that had not yet been published. "Reginald Vance is broke. Savannah's family is completely underwater. Their private equity firm has been bleeding money for 3 years, and they are drowning in toxic debt. Tonight is actually a corporate merger announcement. Kendrick and Reginald are planning to use the gathering of Atlanta elite and local business media to publicly announce that Vance Capital is absorbing Josephine Crown Hair Care into their portfolio." The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath straight out of my lungs. My son was going to stand on a stage that I paid for, drink champagne that I bought, and announce to the entire business community that my life's work was being swallowed up by his father-in-law's failing firm. He wanted to use my pristine, debt-free company to financially bail out the very people who sneered at me for how I made my money. "They cannot absorb my company," I said. my voice dropping to a dangerous, deadly whisper. My hands curled into fists at my sides. I am the sole founder. I hold 100% of the voting shares. The board cannot make a single move without my direct authorization. I would never sign over my legacy to Reginald Vance. They know that. Kendrick knows I would rather burn my factories to the ground than let those vultures touch them. They know you would never sign it in your right mind, Dante corrected. He spun his center monitor around so I could see it clearly. He opened an encrypted email thread between Kendrick Reginald and a name I immediately recognized. Dr. Elias Thorne, a prominent and very expensive neurologist who catered exclusively to Buckhead elite. That is why they told you not to come to the party tonight. Dante continued, his voice shaking with a mixture of disgust and disbelief. They are planning to corner you later. They want to get you alone in the VIP suite. Grandma, look at the attachments. I leaned over the counter and read the screen. My stomach plummeted, the cold realization turning my blood to ice. It was a digital wire transfer receipt showing $20,000 moving from Kendrick's private account into a shell corporation owned by Dr. Thorne. Next to it was an attached PDF file, an official legally binding medical affidavit. I read the words on the screen, feeling a terrifying wave of nausea. The document detailed my supposed symptoms. It claimed I had been exhibiting severe memory loss, unprovoked aggression, and erratic financial behavior. It concluded with Dr. Thorne's forged signature, stating that after extensive evaluation, Josephine Crown is suffering from rapid onset advanced dementia and is legally and mentally incompetent to manage her own financial or medical affairs. They bought a fake diagnosis, I whispered, staring at the screen in absolute horror. My own son bought a medical decree to erase my mind. Dante nodded grimly. They are going to ambush you if you show up tonight. They plan to isolate you in the bridal suite. Savannah's parents have a notary and a lawyer standing by. They are going to present you with the transfer papers for your company. If you refuse to sign them, they are going to use this fake medical affidavit to call emergency services. They plan to tell the authorities you are having a violent manic episode. They will have you sedated, strapped to a gurney, and locked in a state-run psychiatric ward by midnight. Once you are committed, Kendrick gets emergency power of attorney, and he signs the company over to Reginald. The silence in the kitchen was heavy, suffocating. I stood there, a 68-year-old woman in a custom emerald gown, realizing that the child I had carried, the boy, I had worked 16-hour shifts to feed the man whose college tuition I had paid in cash, was actively plotting to destroy my life, my freedom and my sanity, all to impress his bankrupt, snobbish in-laws. They thought I was weak. Because I walked a little slower these days, because I sometimes asked them to repeat themselves when the room was loud. They thought my brain was rotting. They mistook my motherly patience for fragility. They thought they could easily corner a tired old woman, threaten her with a mental asylum, and steal her crown. They forgot who they were dealing with. They forgot that long before I was a wealthy socialite living in a gated mansion, I was a desperate young mother navigating the most ruthless supply chains in the city. They forgot that I built an empire by surviving sharks much bigger and much smarter than Reginald Vance. I took a deep, steadying breath. I reached up and unclasped the delicate pearl necklace around my neck, setting it gently on the marble island. I did not need pearls tonight. I needed armor. I looked at my grandson. He was staring at me, waiting for my reaction, waiting to see if his grandmother would crumble under the weight of this ultimate betrayal. Instead, I reached into my designer purse and pulled out my heavy set of car keys. The metal jingled sharply in the quiet kitchen. Close the laptops. Dante, I commanded, my voice devoid of any warmth or hesitation. Back up those files to the encrypted cloud server and grab your coat. Dante blinked, his eyes widening. What are we doing, Grandma? I turned and walked toward the front door, my posture perfectly straight, my shoulders thrown back. We are not hiding in this house, I said, pushing the heavy oak door open to the cool evening air. We are going to a party, and we are going to burn their entire world to the ground. Before Dante could follow me out, I turned back toward the kitchen island and pointed at the screen containing the medical affidavit. Send everything to Mr. Crawford, I said. The transfer receipt, the emails, the affidavit, the offshore account map. Do not summarize it. Give him the originals, the headers, the timestamps, all of it. Dante nodded and began pushing the files into an encrypted archive. I called my corporate attorney myself. Mr. Crawford answered on the second ring, and I did not waste time explaining how hurt I was. Hurt was irrelevant now. I told him my son and the Vances had prepared fraudulent incapacity papers, that they intended to force a transfer of Josephine Crown Operations LLC, and that they expected to make a public announcement before the end of the evening. There was a long silence on the line, not because he was surprised by family betrayal, but because he understood exactly what kind of legal trap they were trying to build around me. Then he asked one question. "Do you still control the trust and the restructuring documents we executed 6 months ago?" I looked at Dante. "Every page," I said. Mr. Crawford's voice changed immediately. The concern disappeared. What replaced it was the measured calm I had heard from him before hostile negotiations. He told me not to sign anything I had not already decided to use against them, and he reminded me that the operational shell Kendrick believed contained my empire had been stripped of its real assets months earlier. I told him I remembered. More importantly, I told him I wanted him at the club with the red restructuring file the moment Kendrick stood in public and claimed ownership. Mr. Crawford did not ask whether I was certain. He simply said, "I will be there." That was the call Kendrick never imagined I would make. He had expected a frightened mother to call him back and beg for permission to attend a party she had paid for. Instead, while he was probably adjusting his tie and rehearsing his speech, I was activating the legal architecture that could bury his scheme without changing a single fact of what he intended to do. I ended the call and saw Dante studying me from across the island. He looked angry, but beneath the anger was fear. "Grandma, we could just send all this to the police and stay here," he said. "You do not have to walk into their trap." I reached for the velvet watch box on the bed only in my imagination, remembering the gift I had planned to hand Kendrick that night. 6 months of searching for a watch he wanted, and he had spent those same months helping build a cage for me. If I stay home, I said, they announce the lie anyway. They tell investors I am incompetent. They manufacture a crisis around the company and then spend the next week explaining my absence as proof. No, they chose a public stage. They are going to fail on that same stage. In the garage, Dante took the driver's seat of my black Maybach because I wanted my hands free and my attention sharp. During the drive through Atlanta, he reviewed the evidence aloud. He had already mirrored the most important files to an encrypted cloud account that neither Kendrick nor Reginald could reach. He had set automated backups so that deleting one copy would only create another. I told him to route the country club camera feeds into a private recording directory as soon as he reached the AV system. He asked what I planned to do if they truly brought men with sedatives. "I am not going to fight 2 men in a locked room," I answered. "I am going to make Kendrick comfortable enough to confess." Dante glanced at me, understanding the strategy before I finished. The Vances believed age had made me predictable. They believed fear would make me noisy. What they did not understand was that 40 years in business had taught me a simple rule: when someone thinks they have all the power, let them keep talking. Pride is often more useful than a subpoena. As we turned toward Buckhead, I opened my purse and checked the few things I had chosen deliberately. My phone, my reading glasses, the compact Mr. Crawford had once teased me for carrying to every board meeting, and a black tungsten steel emergency pen I kept because factories' warehouses and long drives had taught me never to depend completely on someone else for a locked door or a broken window. I closed the purse and looked out at the city lights. "Once we enter," I told Dante, "you do not stay beside me. They already know you are loyal to me. If they separate us, let them. Get to the AV room. Record everything. Do not expose yourself until I am back in that ballroom." He tightened his hands on the wheel. "And if something goes wrong," he asked, "then you send the evidence," I said. "To Mr. Crawford, to the authorities, and to every place that makes it impossible for them to erase what they did." Dante nodded once. No speeches, no bravado, just a plan. By the time the country club came into view, the shock of Kendrick's text had hardened into something far more useful than anger: precision. The expensive anniversary gift was still sitting unopened on my bed. The emerald gown was still the one I had chosen to celebrate my son, but the woman wearing it was no longer arriving as a mother hoping to be included. I was arriving as the owner of the money, the land, the company, and most importantly, the truth. Kendrick had told me not to come because his in-laws did not want me there. I intended to make sure that before the night ended, nobody in that ballroom would ever forget that I had come anyway. The tires of my black Maybach crunched against the pristine white gravel of the Buckhead Country Club driveway. Dante steered the heavy vehicle past a line of idling luxury sedans, pulling directly up to the grand portico. A young valet in a crisp maroon uniform stepped off the curb, raising a white-gloved hand to halt our approach. He hurried over to my window as it smoothly rolled down. He held a leather-bound clipboard tightly to his chest. He cleared his throat and avoided making direct eye contact with me. "I am terribly sorry, ma'am," he stammered, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "I have specific instructions from Mr. Kendrick Crown. He provided a strict guest list for the private gala tonight. Your name has been explicitly flagged. I am instructed to turn your vehicle away immediately." I did not raise my voice. I did not glare at the young man doing his job. I calmly reached into my evening bag and pulled out my reading glasses. I let the silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds, while the valet began to sweat under the glow of the portico chandeliers. I looked past him, locking eyes with the senior valet manager standing near the valet podium. The manager recognized me instantly. The blood drained from his face, and he sprinted across the gravel, shoving the younger employee aside. "Good evening, Mrs. Crown," the manager gasped, bowing his head slightly. "Please excuse the confusion." "There is no confusion," I said, my voice cutting through the humid Atlanta air like a chilled blade. "My son believes he can dictate who enters a building that sits on a parcel of land owned entirely by my holding company. I lease this exact acreage to the Buckhead Country Club Board of Directors. If I am not allowed to park my car in my own driveway, I will have my legal team terminate the lease agreement at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. You will all be out of a job by lunch." The manager snatched the clipboard from the young valet and threw it onto the hood of a nearby car. He yanked open my passenger door with trembling hands. "Welcome to the club, Mrs. Crown," he said, his voice cracking. "Right this way." Dante handed the keys to the terrified young valet and stepped out, adjusting the cuffs of his dark suit. He offered me his arm. We walked up the wide marble steps together. The heavy brass doors of the club swung open, revealing a wall of sound and light. We stepped across the threshold, leaving the humid night behind us and entering the belly of the beast. The grand ballroom was an obscene display of manufactured wealth. Towering crystal chandeliers dripped from the vaulted ceilings, casting a harsh, glittering light over 300 of Atlanta's most elite socialites. A 12-piece string quartet played classical arrangements of modern songs in the corner, barely heard over the clinking of imported crystal flutes and the arrogant laughter of people who inherited their money instead of earning it. Waiters in white tuxedos circulated with silver trays of beluga caviar and truffle canapes. The center of the room featured a massive, glistening ice sculpture of a crown slowly melting onto a bed of orchids. I took a glass of vintage champagne from a passing waiter and evaluated the room. My money had paid for every single drop of liquor, every flower petal, every note of music. Near the center of the dance floor, Savannah was holding court. She wore a suffocatingly tight silver gown dripping with sequins, a diamond tennis bracelet glittering on her wrist. She was surrounded by her inner circle of country club wives, women who spent their days organizing charity galas for causes they never actually interacted with. Savannah tossed her head back in a practiced musical laugh. Then her eyes scanned the room and locked onto me. The fake smile slid off her face instantly. Her jaw tightened, and her manicured hand gripped her champagne flute so hard her knuckles turned white. She leaned closely into the ear of a woman wearing a hideous feathered hat. The music dipped just enough for her vicious whisper to carry across the polished floorboards directly to where Dante and I were standing. "I cannot believe she actually showed up," Savannah hissed to her friend, her eyes raking over my custom emerald gown with unconcealed disgust. "Kendrick specifically told her to stay hidden at her house. She is going to ruin the entire aesthetic of the merger announcement. You can put her in a designer dress, but she still smells like cocoa butter and storefront hustle. Those ghetto salon roots never wash off. It is an absolute embarrassment to my family's legacy to have her breathing the same air as our investors." Her friend covered her mouth, giggling behind a manicured hand. I did not break my stride. I walked straight toward the center of the room, my heels striking the marble with a steady, rhythmic cadence. Savannah took a step backward as I approached her, bravado faltering under my unyielding gaze. I raised my champagne glass slightly in her direction, acknowledging her insult without speaking a single word. She quickly turned her back to me, pretending to engage in a deep conversation with her friend, but her shoulders were rigid with panic. She knew I had heard her, and she knew I did not care. I let Savannah's insult hang in the air and kept walking. That choice unsettled her more than any argument could have. She had prepared herself for outrage because outrage would have supported the story they planned to tell later. A loud confrontation from an older woman could be recast as instability. A calm woman moving through her own party was harder to explain. I stopped briefly at one table where two longtime distributors greeted me with surprise. They asked why Kendrick had told them I might not attend. I smiled and said, "Apparently there has been some confusion about who is hosting." I gave them nothing more. I wanted the room to remember that I had been present, coherent, and entirely myself before anyone announced a medical crisis. Across the ballroom, Dante had already changed direction. He no longer looked like my escort. He looked like a bored young guest trying to find better reception for his phone. He moved along the perimeter, paused near the service corridor, and disappeared behind a door marked for staff access. Nobody stopped him. The Vances had spent so much time dismissing him that they had trained themselves not to see him as a threat. That was their second great mistake of the night. I continued toward the center of the room. Several guests complimented my gown. One woman asked about a product launch scheduled for the following month, and I answered with the exact distribution date, manufacturing target, and retail rollout we had approved at the last board meeting. I did it deliberately. Every ordinary conversation became a witness statement without anyone realizing it. If Savannah later claimed I could not remember whether I had eaten, there would be people in that room who had just heard me discuss inventory projections from memory. Near the stage, I saw the anniversary slideshow cycling across the screens, photographs of Kendrick and Savannah on vacations at charity dinners, standing beside cars and houses that my money had helped finance. Not one image showed the factories where the wealth behind those photographs had been created. That omission told me everything about how they understood my life. They enjoyed the results and erased the labor. Then the slideshow changed for half a second. A plain black frame flashed across the screen and vanished. Nobody else seemed to notice. I did. It was Dante's signal that he had reached the AV system. I took another sip of champagne and set the glass on a passing tray. The performance could begin. Before I could take another step toward the ice sculpture, a heavy hand clamped down on my left bicep. The grip was shockingly violent, fingers digging into my skin with bruising force. I was yanked roughly sideways, pulled behind a towering floral arrangement of white lilies that shielded us from the view of the main dance floor. It was Kendrick. He was breathing heavily, a sheen of panicked sweat gleaming on his forehead. He had cut through the crowd like a shark the moment he saw me enter. His perfectly tailored Tom Ford suit was immaculate, completely at odds with the ugly, desperate rage contorting his face. "I told you not to come," he hissed, his face leaning dangerously close to mine. His teeth were clenched so tightly his jaw popped. "You are not on the guest list. You are going to turn around right now, walk out those brass doors, and get back in your car. If you make a scene here tonight and humiliate Savannah's parents in front of these private equity partners, I swear to God I will cut you off completely." I looked down at the hand crushing my arm. I did not try to pull away. I did not wince. I slowly looked back up into my son's furious, terrified eyes. "Take your hand off me, Kendrick," I commanded. My voice was not a whisper nor a shout. It was the exact resonant tone I used to negotiate multi-million-dollar supply contracts. It sliced through the surrounding chatter. Several guests standing near the floral arrangement stopped talking and turned their heads. The string quartet seemed to fade into the background. Kendrick swallowed hard, glancing nervously at the wealthy investors watching us. His grip loosened slightly, but he did not let go. "Let me remind you of exactly where you are standing," I said, making sure every syllable carried to the eavesdropping guests. "You are wearing a $5,000 silk suit paid for by the dividends of my ghetto hair oil formulas. You are standing in a ballroom rented by the capital generated from my storefront hustle. You do not have the authority to dismiss the bank that funds your entire existence. Now remove your hand from my arm before I call security to escort a hostile guest out of my party." Kendrick snatched his hand back as if my skin had suddenly caught fire. He wiped his sweaty palm on his expensive trousers, completely emasculated in front of the very society friends he was trying so desperately to impress. He opened his mouth to formulate a response, but his mind was racing too fast. He was completely out of his depth. Reginald Vance materialized from the crowd, stepping smoothly into the tense circle behind the floral arrangement. Savannah's father was the picture of old money arrogance. He possessed a silver mane of hair and a practiced, predatory smile that never reached his dead, calculating eyes. He understood instantly that Kendrick was losing control of the situation. Josephine. What a pleasant surprise. Reginald purred, his voice dripping with synthetic charm. He stepped closely to my right side while Kendrick remained on my left. They formed a solid, aggressive wall around me, blocking my path back to the open ballroom. "We were hoping you would join us, but we really need to discuss the timeline for the evening. Let us step away from the noise to coordinate the announcements." Reginald clamped his large hand onto my right shoulder. Kendrick immediately mirrored the action on my left. They did not guide me. They aggressively marched me forward, forcing me down a dimly lit, restricted hallway labeled VIP Access Only. To the casual observer in the ballroom, it looked like two devoted family members lovingly escorting the elderly matriarch away from the loud music. In reality, I was being physically detained. As they pushed me down the corridor, I caught Dante's eye. He was standing near a waiter station, his laptop bag slung over his shoulder. I gave him a single microscopic nod. Dante instantly turned and slipped away, melting into the shadows and heading straight for the AV control room at the back of the facility. The plan was in motion. Reginald and Kendrick shoved me faster down the carpeted hallway, their grips tightening the further we got from the public eye. We reached the heavy oak double doors at the very end of the corridor. The gold plaque on the wall read "Bridal Suite." Reginald reached out and shoved the heavy brass handle downward, kicking the door wide open. Kendrick pushed me roughly across the threshold. I stumbled forward, my heels sinking into the plush carpet of the suite. Before I could turn around, the heavy oak door slammed shut behind me. I heard the sharp metallic click of the deadbolt sliding into place, followed by the distinctive sound of a heavy chain lock engaging. The music from the ballroom was instantly muffled, leaving only a suffocating silence. I was completely trapped inside the room. The bridal suite looked like a place designed for soft photographs and nervous brides, not extortion. Cream silk curtains framed a wall of mirrors. Fresh roses stood in crystal vases. A low lamp threw warm light across a velvet sofa and a polished vanity. Then I turned and saw the two men standing near the far wall. They were broad-shouldered, expressionless, and dressed in dark medical scrubs that looked deliberately generic. One held a black equipment case. The other wore latex gloves and had already removed a capped syringe from a small insulated pouch. The sight of that needle changed the temperature of the room. Until then, part of me had still been observing the scheme as a business crime, a grotesque attempt to steal control of my company. The syringe made the personal reality unavoidable. My own son had prepared for the possibility that I would say no by hiring men to put chemicals into my body. Savannah was already there, seated beside the vanity with the fake medical affidavit in front of her. She rose when I entered and smiled with the kind of satisfaction that comes from believing an opponent has finally been cornered. Reginald closed the door behind Kendrick, slid the deadbolt into place, and pulled the decorative chain across the frame. I heard the metal settle. Kendrick remained between me and the exit. Savannah lifted the affidavit and tapped it against her palm. "This could have been dignified," she said. "You could have stayed home and let Kendrick make the announcement. Instead, you insisted on showing everyone exactly why we had to intervene." I looked at the needle again. "Intervene?" I asked. "Is that what you are calling this?" Savannah placed the affidavit on the vanity and turned it so the signature line faced me. "Dr. Thorne has certified that you are suffering from advanced dementia. If you become agitated, these men are prepared to keep you safe until you can be transferred for psychiatric evaluation." Her tone was almost cheerful. She wanted the language to sound clinical, respectable, clean. There was nothing clean about two paid strangers waiting to drug a woman into silence. Kendrick dropped a thick stack of documents onto the vanity. The pages landed with a hard slap. On top was the transfer agreement for Josephine Crown Operations, LLC. My name appeared in neat type beside dozens of signature lines. He had placed adhesive flags anywhere he expected me to sign. "We are going to make this very simple," he said. "You sign operational control and ownership to me. I assume management immediately. Reginald's firm handles the merger. You retire tonight." I turned a page slowly. The agreement was 50 pages of polished legal language designed to disguise a theft as succession planning. And if I refuse, I asked. Reginald answered before my son could. "Then we proceed according to the medical recommendation. You are placed under supervision. Emergency guardianship is requested, and Kendrick acts to preserve the company while the court reviews your competence." He spoke as though he were explaining a routine filing. I looked at him and understood why men like Reginald survived for so long in rooms where other people lost everything. He could describe cruelty without changing his breathing. Savannah moved closer. "Nobody wants you hurt, Josephine. We want you managed." The word managed sat between us like poison. I had managed warehouses during power outages, payroll during recessions, and supply chains during strikes. Now a woman who had never built anything without family money was telling me I needed to be managed. "You are going to place me in a psychiatric ward because I will not give you my company," I asked. Savannah shrugged. "If that is what it takes to stop you from damaging the family, yes." I let silence stretch until Kendrick became uncomfortable. He had always hated silence because it forced him to hear himself. "You paid Dr. Thorne?" I asked, keeping my voice small. His eyes flicked briefly toward Reginald. Savannah's mouth tightened. That tiny reaction told me they had not expected me to know the payment existed. I let my shoulders sink and stared at the affidavit as though trying to understand it. "Did I see him?" I asked. "I do not remember seeing him." Kendrick exhaled sharply, mistaking my performance for confusion. "That is the point, Mom," he said. "You do not remember things anymore." I raised a trembling hand to my temple. The movement was deliberate. My fingers shook just enough to be visible. "I thought I was fine this morning." Savannah's face changed. The contempt remained, but now it was mixed with relief. She believed the diagnosis had become real, simply because I had chosen to resemble it. "You have not been fine for months," she said quickly. "You forget conversations. You repeat yourself. You become aggressive." I lowered my eyes. "Maybe I do." Kendrick relaxed for the first time all evening. I could almost see his confidence returning. He stepped closer and softened his voice with an imitation of concern. "This is why I am trying to help you. Sign the papers and let me take care of everything." I looked at the small security camera mounted in the upper corner of the suite. Earlier, Dante had told me that most of the club's interior cameras ran through the same control network as the ballroom screens. The camera's tiny status light blinked once, went dark, then blinked twice. That was our signal. He had the feed. From that moment forward, every word in the room belonged to us. I allowed my breathing to become shallow. I asked Kendrick to explain the papers again slowly, as though my mind could not hold the information. Pride did the rest. He began to talk. He told me the company needed younger leadership. He said the Vances had connections I could never acquire because, in his words, money cannot buy pedigree. He complained that investors were tired of dealing with an old woman who still asked questions about factory costs and product margins instead of letting professional finance people make decisions. I asked why Dr. Thorne had signed an affidavit if he had never examined me. Kendrick laughed. It was not a warm laugh. It was the laugh of a man who believed the danger had passed. "Because I paid him," he said. Savannah snapped her head toward him, but he was enjoying the moment too much to stop. $20,000 bought a diagnosis nobody in this city will challenge. His name opens doors. Once people see that paper, they will assume you forgot the appointment. I pressed my palm against the vanity to make it look as though my knees were weak. "So the doctor lied," I whispered. "Do not make this dramatic," Kendrick replied. "He gave us what we needed. You were never going to cooperate voluntarily." Reginald frowned at him. "Enough detail." Kendrick ignored the warning. He had waited years to tell me that he believed he deserved what I built, and now he thought I was too broken to fight back. "I also adjusted the board notices," he continued. "Your signature was easy to replicate. We created the paperwork required to make tonight look orderly. After you sign, nobody is going to care how we got here." The camera light remained steady. Somewhere beyond the locked door, Dante was recording my son describing forgery and bribery in his own voice. Savannah became impatient with Kendrick's confession. She pushed the transfer agreement closer to me and pointed to the first tab, "Sign." I looked at the document without touching the pen. "What happens to me afterward?" I asked. She crossed her arms. "You go somewhere appropriate." "Home?" I asked. "Not immediately." "A hospital." She rolled her eyes. "A memory care facility, psychiatric observation, whatever the doctors decide. You will be comfortable enough." The cruelty in that last phrase was almost casual. My house, my company, my bank accounts, and even the freedom to decide where I slept were all things they had already divided among themselves. I turned toward Kendrick. "And you would let them take me away tonight?" For one final second, I gave him a chance to show me that some part of the boy I had raised remained inside the man standing before me. He did not hesitate. "If you force me to choose between your feelings and the future of this family, yes." That answer hurt more than the needle. It was also the answer I needed. I let my eyes fill not entirely from acting now. "I worked 16-hour days because I thought I was building security for you," I said. Kendrick's expression stayed hard. "And now I am using it," he replied. One of the men in scrubs stepped forward and uncapped the syringe. He did it slowly enough that I could see the clear liquid inside. Savannah watched my face, waiting for panic. I gave it to her. I backed into the vanity and allowed a frightened sound to escape my throat. "Please put that away." The man looked to Kendrick for instruction. Kendrick nodded toward the document. "She signs nobody touches her." I reached for the pen, then pulled my hand back. "I cannot read all of this." Reginald leaned over the papers. "You do not need to. It transfers the company to Kendrick. That is all." I made my voice smaller. "And if I sign, you promise I do not get the injection." Kendrick stepped directly in front of me. "Sign every page and behave yourself, and you can avoid making this worse." The words were clear. The threat was clear. The camera was recording both. I let my fingers tremble around the pen, but did not lower it to the page yet. I wanted one more thing on the record. "Tell me again why I am sick," I said. Kendrick sighed with theatrical impatience. "You are not sick, Mom. That is the whole point. The dementia affidavit is leverage. I paid the doctor $20,000 to give us something legal enough to scare you and credible enough to use if you refused. Now stop wasting time." Savannah stared at him, horrified by how plainly he had said it. Reginald muttered a curse under his breath. I looked down so they would not see the flash of victory in my eyes. They had just given Dante the sentence that could destroy every lie they planned to tell in the ballroom. I did not need to look at the camera again. The trap was complete. All I had to do was keep them confident long enough to finish it themselves. I let my shoulders fold inward. I asked Savannah for water. She refused. I asked whether I could call Mr. Crawford. Kendrick laughed and told me my attorney had been removed from the guest list and would not be allowed through the door. I murmured that I understood. Then I asked whether they had already told anyone about my supposed dementia. Savannah proudly explained that a few carefully chosen people had been prepared for the announcement and that sympathy would make the merger easier to accept. Reginald added that markets trusted continuity and a tragic retirement story would prevent anyone from asking why the ownership transfer happened so quickly. Their plan depended on people seeing age before evidence. They intended to turn every normal feature of being 68 into proof that I was disappearing. A pause became confusion. A slower step became decline. Anger at being robbed became instability. I realized then that the fraud was bigger than a forged affidavit. They were counting on a cultural assumption that an older woman could be spoken over, managed, and removed without anyone asking whether she still had a voice. That assumption was about to cost them everything. I finally took the fountain pen Kendrick offered. The metal was cold in my hand. I studied my son across the vanity. He saw a frightened old woman preparing to surrender. I saw a man standing inside a room with a live camera, a fake diagnosis paid medic's forged documents, and enough arrogance to confess to all of it. "You are sure this is what you want?" I asked. "Completely," he said. "Your time is over, Mom." I lowered my eyes to the first signature line. Beyond the walls, the band in the ballroom started another song. The celebration Kendrick believed would crown him was already underway. He did not know that the most valuable asset in the building was no longer the company he thought he was stealing. It was the recording of his own voice. Kendrick thrust a heavy gold fountain pen into my right hand, his fingers completely devoid of the warmth a son should hold for his mother. The metal felt ice cold against my skin. The two men in medical scrubs took a synchronized step forward from the shadowy corner of the bridal suite, their heavy boots thudding against the plush carpet. One of them tapped the plastic barrel of the sedative syringe against his thigh, a silent but unmistakable threat. I stared down at the 50-page legal transfer document resting on the polished mahogany vanity. My name was printed at the bottom of every single page, waiting for my authorization to surrender 40 years of sweat, tears, and relentless labor. I let my hand shake violently, ensuring the gold pen rattled against the glass surface of the table. I looked up into Kendrick's eyes, searching for any lingering trace of the little boy I had raised by myself in a cramped two-bedroom apartment on the south side of the city. I reminded him of the nights I stood over boiling vats of raw shea butter until my hands were blistered and numb, just so I could afford his private school tuition. I recounted the years I spent sleeping on a cot in the back of my first freezing warehouse, sacrificing my own youth so he would never have to know what poverty tasted like. I begged him to remember the sacrifices that built the foundation he was currently standing on. I asked him how he could look at the woman who gave him the world and threaten to lock her in a psychiatric ward for the rest of her life. Kendrick did not blink. His posture remained rigidly perfect inside his tailored suit. He looked down his nose at me with an expression of absolute terrifying apathy. He adjusted his silk tie and leaned closer, his cologne smelling of expensive scotch and arrogant ambition. "Your time is over, Mom," he stated, his voice completely hollow and devoid of any human empathy. "You built a nice little storefront business, but you do not have the pedigree to take it global. You are holding us back from real generational wealth. It is my empire now. You can either hand over the crown voluntarily, or we will strip it from you by force. The choice is yours, but the outcome is exactly the same." Savannah scoffed loudly from the opposite side of the vanity, tapping her diamond-manicured nails against the wood. She complained that the jazz band out in the ballroom was already starting their second set and that they were wasting valuable networking time humoring my pathetic emotional manipulation. She demanded that I stop stalling and sign the transfer before she lost her patience and instructed the medics to execute their specific orders. I lowered my head carefully, hiding the sharp predatory calculation forming in my eyes. The trap was finally set completely in motion. I lowered the gold fountain pen to the thick stack of legal documents and pressed the nib against the pristine white paper. I deliberately made my signature look slightly erratic, perfectly mimicking the declining motor skills of an elderly woman suffering from advanced neurological decay. I dragged the pen across the first dotted line, the scratchy sound of the metal tip echoing loudly in the tense silence of the bridal suite. I turned the page with trembling fingers, repeating the process on the second page, then the third, moving methodically through the entire 50-page corporate transfer agreement. Every stroke of the pen legally surrendered another piece of my manufacturing factories, my national distribution networks, and my commercial real estate holdings. I initialed the margin of the final page and dropped the pen onto the vanity. Before the instrument even stopped rolling, Savannah lunged across the table like a starving animal. She snatched the heavy stack of papers with both hands, her chest heaving as she hyperventilated with pure, unadulterated, greedy joy. A manic, triumphant laugh escaped her throat. She clutched the documents to her sequined bodice, her eyes wide and shining with the realization that she had just stolen a multi-million-dollar fortune without working a single day for it. She practically shoved the entire stack of papers into the hands of her father, Reginald Vance. Reginald adjusted his reading glasses and scrutinized the pages with the sharp, predatory intensity of a seasoned corporate raider. He flipped through the document rapidly, verifying that my erratic signature was present on every required line, ensuring that the transfer of operations was legally ironclad. A slow, sickeningly satisfied smile spread across his weathered face. He looked up at Kendrick and gave a firm, definitive nod of approval. He declared the signatures absolutely perfect and legally binding. Reginald carefully slid the 50-page document into a slim leather folio, securing it beneath his arm like a prized trophy. The power dynamics inside the room shifted instantly. In their minds, I was no longer the formidable matriarch who commanded boardrooms and negotiated international trade deals. I was just a broken, discarded asset, a problem they had successfully neutralized and swept under the rug. Savannah strutted over to Kendrick and wrapped her arms around his neck, kissing him deeply in celebration of their successful extortion. They whispered excitedly about the immediate liquidation of my commercial warehouses and the massive influx of capital that would save Reginald's failing private equity firm by Monday morning. They were already spending my money in their heads, completely oblivious to the club's own security camera above them, which Dante was routing from the AV control room into a secure, encrypted archive. I remained slumped in my chair, keeping my head bowed in a posture of utter defeat. I waited patiently while they reveled in their false victory, knowing that their celebration was built on a foundation of absolute sand. The higher they elevated themselves on this stolen triumph, the harder their inevitable fall would be. Kendrick turned his attention away from his celebrating wife and focused his cold gaze on the two men in medical scrubs. He stepped toward them, pulling a thick envelope of cash from his inner jacket pocket. He handed the payment to the taller medic, giving him a set of explicit, ruthless instructions. He ordered the men to exit the bridal suite and position themselves directly outside the heavy oak doors. They were commanded to stand guard in the restricted hallway and ensure that absolutely no one entered the room. Kendrick stated that if I attempted to open the door, scream for help, or escape into the corridor, they were to immediately breach the room, administer the heavy sedative syringe, and utilize the fake dementia affidavit to physically restrain me. The medics nodded silently, pocketing the bribe money, their faces completely devoid of any moral conflict. They turned and exited the suite, the heavy brass lock clicking firmly into place as they secured the perimeter from the outside. Kendrick walked back over to where I was sitting, looming over my chair with the supreme arrogance of a conquering king who had just slaughtered his greatest rival. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at my face, laying out the final phase of his treacherous scheme. He ordered me to stay absolutely silent and remain locked inside the room for the next hour. He explained that he, Savannah, and Reginald were going to walk out into the grand ballroom together. They were going to step onto the main stage, command the attention of the 300 elite guests, and put on a spectacular performance of family tragedy. He planned to grab the microphone and publicly announce my sudden heartbreaking medical retirement due to a severe and rapid cognitive decline. He intended to tell my oldest friends, my fiercely loyal business partners, and the local media that I was no longer capable of managing my own basic needs. Then, he would proudly announce the immediate corporate merger, framing his hostile takeover as a noble, desperate attempt to save his ailing mother's legacy from total ruin. Savannah added that once the announcement was finished and the guests had properly offered their sympathies, they would return to the suite, quietly escort me out the back service exit, and drop me off at an isolated memory care facility on the outskirts of the city. Kendrick buttoned his suit jacket, checked his reflection in the vanity mirror, and offered me one last sickeningly sweet smile. He told me to enjoy the quiet, turned on his heel, and walked out the door with his wife and father-in-law following closely behind. The heavy oak door slammed shut. The deadbolt engaged with a loud metallic thud, sealing me inside the luxurious prison. I listened closely as their confident footsteps faded down the hallway, heading toward the main ballroom to deliver their grand, fabricated tragedy to the waiting crowd. The room was finally dead silent. The instant their footsteps disappeared down the restricted hallway, I stopped trembling. My hand became steady before the deadbolt had finished vibrating in its frame. I straightened my back, wiped the manufactured fear from my face, and looked toward the security camera. The tiny status light blinked twice. Dante was still in the AV control room. He had the recording. I did not need him physically beside me. I needed him exactly where he was controlling the cameras, the microphones, and the ballroom screens. I opened my clutch and checked my phone. One message waited on the lock screen. Secured. Backups complete. AV access live. I typed only 3 words in reply: go to stage. Then I put the phone away. The front door was useless. Kendrick had left the 2 paid medics outside it, and I had no intention of turning a clean recording of extortion into a physical struggle in a narrow hallway. Instead, I crossed the bridal suite toward the private garden side, where floor-to-ceiling glass doors faced a secluded terrace. The doors were locked by an electronic keypad. I tried the handle once, confirmed it would not move, and reached into my purse for the black tungsten steel emergency pen I had checked before leaving home. I had carried tools like that for years because factories teach practical habits. Doors jam, windshields crack, locks fail. Elegant surroundings do not make emergencies elegant. I wrapped a decorative hand towel around my hand, placed the hardened tip against the lower corner of the tempered pane, and struck. The first impact produced a white star in the glass. The second spread a web of fractures outward. I hit the same point a third time, then pushed carefully. The pane collapsed in small cubes onto the stone terrace. The music from the ballroom swallowed most of the sound. I stepped through the opening, gathered the hem of my emerald gown above the glass, and moved into the cool Atlanta night. For a moment I stood under the garden lights and listened. No alarm, no shout from the hallway. Kendrick's guards were still protecting an empty room. I moved quickly along the terrace past clipped hedges and a stone fountain circling toward the ballroom's public entrance. My phone vibrated once. Dante had sent a second message. They are on stage. Mic ready. I could picture the room without seeing it. Kendrick standing beneath the chandeliers, Savannah beside him in silver sequins, Reginald preparing to transform my disappearance into a corporate announcement. They believed I was locked 20 yards away, frightened and defeated. That confidence was the final ingredient I needed. I brushed one tiny shard of glass from my sleeve, smoothed the front of my gown, and lifted my chin. When I reached the side entrance to the ballroom, I paused behind the closed doors. Through the wood, I could hear Kendrick's amplified voice. He was already telling 300 people that his mother had suffered a devastating cognitive decline. I closed my eyes for 1 second, not because I doubted what I was about to do, but because I wanted to remember the exact sensation of hearing my own son publicly erase me while I stood alive, lucid, and listening on the other side of the door. Then I placed my hand on the brass handle. Kendrick thought he had buried me in a locked bridal suite. He was about to discover that I had simply stepped outside his version of the story. Kendrick's voice floated through the door with practiced sorrow. "Many of you have known my mother for decades," he was saying. "You know how fiercely independent she has always been, which makes what I have to share tonight especially painful." I opened the ballroom door only a few inches and remained hidden behind a column near the rear of the room. From there I could see the stage and almost every table without being seen myself. Kendrick stood beneath the crown-shaped ice sculpture with one hand wrapped around the microphone and the other pressed dramatically against his chest. He looked as though he were delivering a eulogy. Savannah stood half a step behind him, eyes lowered in counterfeit grief. Reginald waited near the podium with the leather folio containing the papers I had just signed. The room was quiet enough to hear silverware touch china. "My mother has been diagnosed with rapidly advancing Alzheimer's disease," Kendrick continued. A wave of sympathetic murmurs moved across the ballroom. "We kept this private because we wanted to protect her dignity. Unfortunately, the disease has progressed much faster than any of us expected. I watched men who had negotiated with me for years bow their heads. Women who had attended my product launches placed hands over their mouths. None of them knew that I was standing less than 50 feet away, listening to my own obituary." Kendrick's performance became more confident as the room gave him the sympathy he wanted. "There have been episodes of confusion," he said, "periods of anger. She has become unable to make complex decisions without becoming distressed." The lie was designed carefully. He did not say I had forgotten my name or failed a medical test. He described ordinary human moments and wrapped them in medical language. He was not merely declaring me sick. He was teaching the audience how to reinterpret everything they had ever seen me do. Savannah took the microphone. Her expression was so solemn that for an instant I wondered whether she had rehearsed in a mirror. "This has been heartbreaking for our family," she said. "There are days when Josephine forgets whether she has eaten. There are times when she cannot dress without assistance. She has become frightened in familiar rooms. We have tried to support her privately, but tonight she experienced another episode and needed to be taken somewhere quiet." I almost admired the audacity. Less than 20 minutes earlier, Savannah had watched me sign page after page under threat of sedation. Now she was telling the room I could not dress myself while I stood behind a column in a custom gown she had insulted because it looked too good. A woman at a nearby table whispered, "Poor Josephine." The words cut deeper than Savannah's cruelty. Pity was doing exactly what the Vances needed it to do. It was making smart people stop asking questions. Savannah's voice softened further. "We know many of you love her. We ask that you respect her privacy as we move her into a level of care appropriate for her condition." Appropriate for her condition. The phrase echoed the threat she had made in the suite. I noticed two guests exchange uneasy looks. They had seen me enter the ballroom earlier. They had seen me walk without assistance and confront Kendrick with complete clarity. But the authority of a medical diagnosis, even a false one, was powerful. Savannah knew it. She raised the affidavit in one hand, as if the paper itself were proof enough to replace the woman it described. "Her neurologist has confirmed that she is no longer legally competent to manage her medical or financial affairs," she said. That was Reginald's cue. He approached the microphone with the confidence of a man who believed the unpleasant family portion of the evening was finished and the profitable portion could begin. He thanked the guests for their compassion. Then he shifted smoothly into business language. "Josephine built something extraordinary," he said. "The crown name represents perseverance, entrepreneurship, and excellence. Our responsibility now is to protect that legacy from instability." He opened the leather folio and removed the transfer agreement. Earlier this evening, while she was still capable of expressing her wishes with assistance, Josephine executed a comprehensive transfer of operational authority and ownership to her son, Kendrick Crown. A murmur rolled through the room, this one sharper. Investors leaned forward. Local business reporters lifted their phones. Reginald paused until he had everyone's attention. Effective immediately, Josephine Crown Operations LLC will be integrated into the Vance Capital portfolio. The combination creates a stronger platform, protects thousands of jobs, and ensures continuity during a difficult family transition. The language was flawless because men like Reginald had spent lifetimes learning how to wrap self-interest in phrases like continuity and protection. Behind him, a large projection screen changed from anniversary photographs to a polished merger graphic bearing both family names. Dante had not interfered yet. He was letting them finish. Kendrick returned to the microphone and placed an arm around Savannah. "I never wanted to take over this way," he said. "But sometimes leadership means making painful decisions for the people you love." Applause began near the front tables. It spread hesitantly, then more confidently, as guests followed one another. I watched 300 people applaud the theft of my company because the thieves had presented it as a sacrifice. That sound clarified something inside me. I could have walked onto the stage the moment Kendrick mentioned Alzheimer's. I could have interrupted Savannah before she told strangers I could not feed myself. But then they might later claim they had misspoken, that grief had made them imprecise, that there had been a misunderstanding. I wanted the entire lie. I wanted the merger announced. I wanted the signed papers displayed. I wanted witnesses to hear them claim exactly what they had tried to force me to surrender. I pulled my phone from my purse and typed one word to Dante: "Now." The applause continued for another 2 seconds. Then the audio system cracked softly. Kendrick glanced toward the ceiling. Savannah frowned. Reginald looked toward the AV booth at the rear balcony. The merger graphic vanished from the projection screens, replaced by a plain black background. The microphones on stage went dead. Kendrick tapped his twice. Nothing. He turned angrily toward a club employee near the sound console. Before he could speak, the ballroom doors behind me opened fully. I stepped into the center aisle. At first, only the guests nearest the rear noticed. Their faces changed one by one. A man lowered his champagne glass. A woman stopped clapping with her hands suspended in midair. Then heads turned farther forward until a ripple of silence moved toward the stage. Kendrick was still trying to understand why the room had stopped responding when Savannah saw me. Her face lost all color. I walked slowly, not because I was frail, but because I wanted everyone to see each step. My posture was straight. My hands were steady. I did not look confused. I did not look lost. I looked exactly like the woman many of those people had negotiated with, competed against, borrowed from, underestimated, and eventually learned to respect. The ballroom became so quiet that my heels sounded louder than the band had. Kendrick lifted his dead microphone. "Mom." The word escaped before he could control it. Dante had left one channel live, the small wireless lapel microphone, clipped beneath the edge of my gown. I touched it once. My voice filled the ballroom from every speaker. "I do not recall authorizing a merger." Several guests gasped. Kendrick stared at the sound system, then at me. I continued walking. "But I do recall signing my own death warrant about 20 minutes ago." Nobody applauded now. Savannah grabbed her microphone again, but Dante kept it muted. Her lips moved with no sound. That small technical detail stripped away the advantage she had used all evening. For once, she could not speak over me. I reached the center of the room and stopped beneath the chandelier. "You told these people I cannot dress myself," I said, looking directly at her. "Savannah, you insulted this dress less than an hour ago. Apparently my dementia has excellent taste." A few nervous laughs broke from the crowd before dying quickly. Savannah shook her head frantically. Kendrick moved toward the edge of the stage. "Mom, you should not be out here," he said, forgetting his microphone was dead. I heard him anyway because the room was silent. Why, I asked through my lapel mic. "Because the 2 men you paid to sedate me are guarding an empty bridal suite." The reaction was immediate. Guests turned toward one another. Phones rose. Reginald's face tightened. Kendrick pointed at me. "She is confused. This is exactly what we were talking about." "Am I?" I asked. "Then perhaps you should explain why a confused woman knows the exact amount you transferred to Dr. Elias Thorne." Savannah's eyes widened. Reginald took one step backward. $20,000, I said. The number landed harder than a shout. I looked around the room. That is what my son paid for the medical affidavit Savannah just held up as proof that my mind is failing. $20,000 to manufacture a diagnosis from a doctor who never examined me. Kendrick tried his microphone again. Dante allowed it to come alive for a fraction of a second, just long enough for the ballroom to hear Kendrick shout, "Turn her mic off!" Then Dante killed it again. I smiled without humor. "No, son. You have had the microphone long enough." I resumed walking toward the stage. The crowd opened for me. People who had been applauding only moments earlier stepped aside as if ashamed to block my path. I passed the table where Savannah's closest friends sat. None of them met my eyes. I passed business partners who had known me since my first warehouse. One older investor whispered, "Josephine, what is happening?" I did not stop. "You are about to find out," I said. I stopped at the foot of the stage and looked up at my son. "You wanted me gone before the announcement," I said. "Now I am here. Finish it in front of me." The sharp, piercing sound of crystal shattering against the polished stage floor echoed through the dead silent ballroom. Kendrick had dropped his champagne flute. The expensive liquid splashed across his polished leather shoes, but he did not even look down. His jaw hung slack. He stared at me as if a ghost had just materialized from the floorboards. Savannah reacted a fraction of a second later. Her survival instinct kicked in, fueled entirely by sheer panic and a desperate need to maintain control over the narrative she had carefully constructed for her high society friends. She lunged forward and grabbed the microphone stand. "Grab her!" Savannah shrieked, her voice shrill and echoing. "Get in here right now. She is having a severe medical episode. Grab the confused woman and escort her out before she hurts herself." 4 large security guards in dark suits immediately broke from the perimeter of the room. They rushed down the center aisle toward me. Their heavy boots thudded against the hardwood floor. They were moving fast, conditioned to follow the orders of the people standing on the stage. I did not step backward. I did not raise my hands in defense. I simply stopped walking and squared my shoulders. I turned my head slowly, fixing my gaze on the lead guard approaching my left side. I drew upon every single ounce of authority I had cultivated over 40 years of commanding commercial warehouses, managing rough supply chains, and staring down ruthless corporate rivals. "Stop right there," I commanded. My voice did not require a microphone to carry the absolute weight of a direct order. The lead guard froze in his tracks. He was less than 3 feet away from me. His momentum caused him to stumble slightly as he abruptly halted. The other 3 guards stopped a second later, exchanging confused, nervous glances. I looked directly into the lead guard's eyes. "I know your boss, Marcus. I know the agency you work for. And I am the person who signs the checks that clear your invoices every single month. If you lay one finger on my dress, you will not only be unemployed by midnight, but I will personally ensure you never work in private security in the state of Georgia ever again." The guard swallowed hard. I took a very deliberate step backward, creating space between us. He lowered his hands and clasped them respectfully in front of his waist. The other guards immediately mirrored his posture. They recognized exactly who held the real power in the room. I was not a confused, frail, elderly woman wandering into a party. I was the apex predator, and they were smart enough not to cross me. I turned my attention back to the stage and resumed my walk, leaving the paralyzed security detail standing helplessly in the aisle. Savannah was hyperventilating now, clutching the microphone stand as if it were a life raft. Kendrick took a hesitant step backward, retreating from the edge of the stage as I approached the short flight of velvet-lined stairs. I ascended the steps slowly, letting the entire ballroom watch my perfectly steady, coordinated movements. I stepped onto the platform and walked directly up to my trembling daughter-in-law. I reached out and calmly pried her fingers off the microphone stand one by one. She was shaking so violently her diamond bracelets rattled. I pulled the microphone toward me. "You wanted a public announcement, Savannah," I said smoothly into the microphone. "Let us give your prestigious guests exactly what they came for, a masterclass in corporate reality." I turned away from her and locked my eyes on Reginald Vance and his wife. They were sitting at the primary VIP table, their faces drained of all color. "You sold this crowd a very touching story tonight. You claimed this merger was a noble rescue mission to preserve my failing legacy. Let us look at the actual numbers." I scanned the faces of the wealthy investors, socialites, and media figures filling the room. My voice was crisp, analytical, and entirely devoid of emotion. Vance Capital is currently bleeding capital at an unsustainable rate. Reginald, your firm, lost $12 million last quarter alone on that disastrous commercial development project in Buckhead. Your offshore hedge funds are currently facing a massive liquidity crisis. You have leveraged your primary estate, your vacation homes, and even the trust funds you set up for your grandchildren just to keep the lights on and pay your mounting legal fees. Gasps erupted from the surrounding tables. The elite society members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Several people immediately pulled out their phones, rapidly texting their own financial advisors. Reginald stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the floor. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "This is slander," he shouted, his face turning a deep, mottled red. "You are clearly suffering from a manic delusion. These claims are entirely baseless and actionable in a court of law." I smiled coldly. "They are not baseless, Reginald. My grandson Dante accessed your supposedly secure servers 2 hours ago. We have the internal audit reports. We have the frantic emails you sent to your offshore creditors begging for extensions. We have the complete documentation of your impending insolvency. You are bankrupt. You are drowning in toxic debt. And you orchestrated this entire pathetic spectacle tonight for one simple reason. You needed to absorb Josephine Crown Hair Care because my company holds $60 million in pure, unencumbered liquid assets. You needed my cash to bail out your sinking ship." The whispers in the ballroom grew to a low, chaotic roar. Savannah covered her face with her hands, sobbing, as the social execution of her family unfolded live on stage. The people she had spent her entire life trying to impress were now looking at her with open, unvarnished disgust. "You did not orchestrate a merger to save me," I concluded, my voice echoing powerfully above the noise of the crowd. "You orchestrated a hostile takeover to save yourselves from total financial ruin. You tried to throw a woman who built her fortune from the dirt up into a psychiatric ward just so you could steal her wallet and maintain your fake elite country club lifestyle." Kendrick suddenly snapped out of his paralyzed state. The reality of the social and financial destruction happening around him triggered a desperate, animalistic survival instinct. He lunged forward and snatched his own microphone from the podium. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and yanked out the folded 50-page legal transfer document I had signed in the bridal suite. He held the thick stack of papers high in the air, waving them frantically like a shield against the incoming barrage of truth. "It does not matter what you say," Kendrick screamed into the microphone, his voice cracking with pure desperation. "It does not matter what you accuse us of, or what documents you claim to have hacked. You signed the transfer." He pointed aggressively at the papers in his hand. "You signed the operational control over to me 10 minutes ago in the suite. Savannah's parents have a notary waiting. This document makes me the sole legal owner and controlling partner of Josephine Crown Operations, LLC. You can stand up here and spin whatever wild conspiracy theories your diseased mind can come up with, but the law is the law. I am the CEO now. I control the assets. I make the decisions. And my first official act as the owner of this empire is to have you permanently removed from the premises." I was breathing heavily, his chest heaving as he tried to regain control of the room. He glared at me with a mixture of hatred and terrified defiance. He truly believed the piece of paper in his hand was an impenetrable suit of armor. The crowd fell silent again, unsure of how to process the conflicting claims. Kendrick had the physical document, and in the corporate world, signatures dictated reality. Suddenly, a deep, booming voice interrupted the silence from the very back of the grand ballroom. "That signature is indeed legally binding, Kendrick," the voice called out, projecting with the trained resonance of a courtroom litigator. The heavy oak doors at the rear entrance swung wide open. Mr. Crawford, my fiercely loyal and utterly ruthless corporate attorney, marched down the center aisle. I was a tall, imposing figure in a charcoal pinstripe suit. The crowd naturally parted for him as he strode purposefully toward the stage. In his right hand he carried a thick, bright red legal folder. Kendrick had explicitly barred Mr. Crawford from the guest list, knowing my attorney would instantly recognize the fraudulent nature of the medical affidavit. Seeing him here now caused Kendrick's brief surge of confidence to evaporate instantly. "What are you doing here?" Kendrick demanded, his voice dropping an octave as panic crept back into his tone. "You are trespassing. Security, remove him." The security guards did not move a single muscle. Mr. Crawford ignored Kendrick's command entirely. He walked up the velvet-lined stairs with measured, deliberate steps and took his place right beside me on the stage. He opened the bright red folder and pulled out a fresh stack of legal documents. He adjusted his glasses and looked directly at my trembling son. Mr. Crawford stepped up to the podium, commandeering the microphone that Savannah had abandoned. He cleared his throat, ensuring he had the absolute attention of every single investor, socialite, and media representative in the room. He looked at the crumpled transfer document Kendrick was clutching so desperately. "Allow me to be the first to officially congratulate you, Mr. Crown," Mr. Crawford said. His tone was perfectly pleasant, but his eyes were entirely devoid of warmth. I have personally reviewed a digital copy of the document you are holding. I can confirm to everyone in this room that the signatures are authentic. The transfer protocols were executed correctly. You are indeed the 100% sole owner and the entirely legally responsible party for Josephine Crown Operations, LLC. Kendrick let out a massive, shuddering breath of relief. A wild, arrogant grin split across his face. He lowered the papers, looking out at the crowd with renewed vindication. He turned to Savannah, grabbing her hand and squeezing it tightly. He thought he had won. He believed that despite the public embarrassment and the exposure of his in-laws' financial ruin, he had still managed to secure the ultimate prize. He puffed out his chest, preparing to deliver another speech, asserting his dominance and dismissing me from the building. I thought the battle was over, and the empire was firmly in his grasp. Then Mr. Crawford smiled. It was a terrifying shark-like expression that sent a visible shiver down Kendrick's spine. "Unfortunately for you, Kendrick," Mr. Crawford continued, his voice echoing cleanly through the silent ballroom, "that specific LLC you just fought so hard to acquire is completely empty." The arrogant grin vanished from Kendrick's face in an instant. He blinked rapidly, confusion washing over his features. He asked what my attorney was talking about. He claimed that the LLC controlled the entire manufacturing fleet, the domestic warehouses, and the liquid capital accounts. He insisted that the document gave him full operational authority over the entire supply chain. Mr. Crawford shook his head slowly. "It gave you authority over a hollow shell," he corrected. "You see, when your mother first suspected that you and Savannah were engaging in financial irregularities several months ago, she instructed me to completely restructure her corporate holdings. We executed a massive silent reorganization. We legally transferred all the physical factories, the commercial real estate, the liquid capital, the brand trademarks, and every single piece of intellectual property out of Josephine Crown Operations, LLC. Kendrick stared at the lawyer, his mouth hanging open as the devastating reality of the situation began to settle over him. "Where did you put it?" Kendrick whispered, his voice barely audible over the microphone. Mr. Crawford tapped the red folder in his hands. "We moved every single asset into a brand-new ironclad and entirely untouchable blind trust," he explained to the captivated audience. "A trust that your mother controls completely. A trust that you have absolutely zero legal access to. You just committed extortion, bribery, and fraud to steal a worthless, empty piece of paper." For several seconds, Kendrick could only stare at Mr. Crawford. He had built his entire plan around one assumption, that the name of the company and the assets of the company were the same thing. I had allowed him to keep that assumption because greed makes people careless with definitions. 6 months earlier, when irregular withdrawals first appeared in internal reports, Mr. Crawford and I had separated the living body of my business from the operational shell Kendrick could reach. The factory's patents, trademarks, distribution contracts, cash reserves, and real estate moved into the trust. Josephine Crown Operations, LLC remained active, but it no longer contained the fortune Kendrick imagined. It contained something else. I stepped beside Mr. Crawford and took the microphone. "You kept calling it an empty company," I told Kendrick. "That is not entirely accurate." His face tightened. Reginald's attention snapped toward me. Unlike Kendrick, he understood immediately that an empty company and a worthless company were not necessarily the same thing. 3 weeks ago, I continued. Dante completed the tracing work on a series of loans you and Reginald had been hiding through offshore entities. $45 million in borrowed money. My forged signature appeared on guarantees. The operational LLC appeared as collateral. You thought the layers of shell companies made the debt invisible. Kendrick shook his head. "You cannot prove that." Dante's name had barely left my mouth earlier, yet the fear in Kendrick's eyes told the room he already knew the answer. Mr. Crawford opened another section of the red folder. "The lenders have complete transaction records," he said. "The beneficial ownership trail is preserved. The forged authorizations are preserved. So are the communications connecting Mr. Crown and Mr. Vance to the borrowing." Reginald pushed through the people near the front table. "Those liabilities were not supposed to remain with that entity." Mr. Crawford looked at him calmly. "They remained exactly where the contracts placed them." Savannah turned toward her father. "What liabilities?" No one answered her immediately. "I did. The $45 million your husband borrowed and concealed." Her expression changed from anger to incomprehension. "Kendrick." He looked away. I continued. When I moved my real assets into the trust, I did not erase the obligations attached to Josephine Crown Operations LLC. I left them there. I froze further access, preserved the records, and waited. Kendrick's voice rose. You set me up. No, I said. I protected myself from a crime you had already committed. Tonight you insisted on becoming the sole owner of the entity you had abused. You threatened me until I signed it over. Mr. Crawford has already confirmed that the transfer is valid. Kendrick looked down at the document in his hands, as though the pages had changed while he was not looking. Mr. Crawford spoke with the same calm he used when explaining an unpleasant clause to an executive who had failed to read it. The transfer you demanded assigns you 100% ownership of Josephine Crown Operations, LLC. The entity has no meaningful operating assets left. It does, however, remain responsible for $45 million in outstanding obligations connected to the fraudulent borrowing scheme. By accepting sole ownership and control, you have placed yourself at the center of those liabilities, subject to the lender's rights and the criminal investigation into how the loans were obtained. Reginald went pale. Savannah whispered, "No." I turned to Kendrick. "You wanted the company so badly that you never asked what was still inside it." His mouth opened, but no words came. "Factories," I said. "Gone to the trust. Patents gone. Cash gone. Real estate gone. The debt you created while forging my authority, still there." A strange sound moved through the ballroom, half gasp and half murmur. The same guests who had applauded the merger were now doing arithmetic in their heads. Mr. Crawford closed the folder. "The principal lenders have been notified of the ownership transfer. Their counsel has the documentation. The outstanding balances become immediately relevant to Mr. Crown's personal and corporate financial position. He has 30 days before the most aggressive recovery provisions begin." Kendrick's fingers tightened around the transfer agreement. "I did not agree to $45 million. You agreed to the entity," Mr. Crawford replied. "You cannot force your mother to hand you a company and then choose only the pieces you like." I watched the realization move across my son's face slowly. First disbelief, then calculation, then terror. He looked at Reginald as if expecting the older man to rescue him. Reginald looked back with something worse than fear-blame. Kendrick took one unsteady step toward me. "Mom, reverse it." "You told me the law was the law," I reminded him. His eyes filled with panic. "You said your first act as owner would be to remove me from the premises." Kendrick, Savannah whispered, "Tell me she is lying." He did not answer. Mr. Crawford held up the transfer one last time. "Congratulations, Mr. Crown. You finally own exactly what you demanded." That was when Kendrick's knees gave way. Kendrick stared at the 50-page document still clutched in his trembling hand. The realization of what he had just willingly accepted crashed into him with the force of a derailed freight train. The arrogant posture he had maintained all evening completely evaporated. His knees gave out. He collapsed onto the polished hardwood floor of the stage, the fabric of his $5,000 suit pooling around him in a pathetic heap. He looked at the signature he had been so desperate to secure the ink that he thought guaranteed his ascension to a corporate throne. Instead, it was a financial death warrant, $45 million. He whispered the number as if trying to comprehend its massive scale. He looked up at Mr. Crawford, his eyes wide and bloodshot with absolute terror. "You cannot do this," he gasped, his voice entirely stripped of its former authority. "I only signed for the operational control of the logistics network. I did not sign for any liabilities." Mr. Crawford looked down at him with the clinical detachment of a mortician. "That is not how corporate law works." Kendrick, my attorney, stated, his voice projecting perfectly across the silent ballroom. "When you forcibly coerced your mother into transferring the sole ownership of Josephine Crown Operations LLC to your name, you assumed total legal responsibility for the entity in its entirety. You accepted its assets, which are currently non-existent, and its liabilities, which are catastrophic. Those fraudulent offshore loans you secured to cover your failing cryptocurrency investments were taken out using the company name as primary collateral. The federal banking institutions are already aware of the transfer of ownership. You have exactly 30 days to produce $45 million in liquid cash to satisfy the outstanding balances. If you fail to meet this non-negotiable deadline, the banks will immediately initiate asset seizure protocols. They will foreclose on your Buckhead mansion. They will repossess your luxury vehicles. They will garnish every future wage you ever earn. You are personally, entirely, and inescapably liable for every single penny of that criminal debt." Kendrick dropped the papers. They scattered across the stage floor like dead leaves. He began to hyperventilate. He grabbed his chest, struggling to draw oxygen into his lungs as the sheer magnitude of his ruin settled over him. He had spent months plotting to steal my life's work, treating my legacy as a disposable stepping stone to elevate his own social status. Now he was facing absolute destitution. The crushing weight of the federal bank loans pressed down on him, stripping away the polished, wealthy facade he had spent his entire adult life carefully constructing. He looked out at the sea of elite investors and high society socialites watching him from the ballroom floor. The same people he had tried to impress by publicly humiliating me were now witnessing his complete and utter financial destruction. There was no escape. There was no clever legal loophole. He had willingly walked into the trap, locked the door behind himself, and swallowed the poison pill. The gravity of the situation hit Reginald Vance a fraction of a second later. The patriarch of the supposedly prestigious Vance family turned violently toward his son-in-law. The aristocratic old money composure that Reginald wielded like a weapon completely shattered. His face morphed into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. "You promised me those offshore loans were entirely untraceable," Reginald roared, his voice cracking with panic. "You swore to me on your life that the debt was buried under 3 layers of blind shell corporations. You told me my firm was fully insulated from the fallout." Kendrick scrambled backward on the stage floor, trying to put distance between himself and his enraged father-in-law. "I thought they were hidden," Kendrick stammered, raising his hands in a desperate plea for mercy. "I thought I had wiped the digital footprint. I did not know Dante was tracking the IP addresses." Reginald's wife, a woman who had spent the entire evening looking down her surgically enhanced nose at my working-class manners, let out a piercing shriek. She lunged forward and grabbed her husband's arm, her diamond rings digging into his tuxedo jacket. "Reginald, our names are tied to those specific collateral guarantees," she screamed, completely abandoning any pretense of high society elegance. "If the federal bank seize his assets, they're going to come directly after Vance Capital. We put up our primary estate in Alpharetta to secure the final bridge loan. If Kendrick defaults in 30 days, the banks are going to take our home. We are going to lose absolutely everything." The elite family that had spent years treating me like an embarrassing, unrefined peasant was now tearing each other apart on a brightly lit stage. Reginald grabbed Kendrick by the collar of his suit, hauling him halfway off the floor. "You arrogant, incompetent fool!" Reginald spat his face inches from my son's terrified eyes. "I compromised my entire family legacy to back your pathetic investments. You assured me that forcing your mother out would solve our liquidity crisis. Instead, you just handed the federal government a direct map to my private accounts. I will ruin you myself before I let the banks take my property." Savannah rushed forward, trying to pry her father's hands off her husband. "Stop it!" she shrieked, batting at Reginald's arms. "People are watching us. We are making a scene." But it was entirely too late for that. The 300 wealthy guests in the ballroom were watching the brawl with morbid, captivated fascination. The polished, elegant veneer of the Vance family had been stripped away, revealing the desperate, greedy reality beneath. I stood perfectly still and watched the class warfare I had endured for decades completely implode. They had mocked my calloused hands and my lack of country club pedigree. Yet here they were fighting like street brawlers over money they had stolen, facing absolute ruin because they were too arrogant to realize they had been outsmarted. Savannah realized her father was beyond reason. She released Kendrick's jacket and spun around to face Mr. Crawford. Her eyes were wide with a frantic, animalistic desperation. She shoved her way past her parents and stopped inches from my attorney. "Mr. Crawford, you have to reverse the signature," Savannah begged, her voice trembling violently. "You are a lawyer. You know this was done under duress." Kendrick was not in his right mind. "We can invalidate the transfer document. We can tear it up right now and pretend this never happened. You have the power to stop the banks from coming after us." Mr. Crawford did not take a single step backward. He looked down at Savannah with a mixture of professional boredom and profound distaste. He slowly opened the thick red legal folder he had been carrying. He removed a single sheet of heavy parchment paper bearing the official seal of the state of Georgia. "I cannot reverse a legally executed transfer of liability," Mr. Crawford stated calmly. And even if I possessed that authority, I would not use it to assist individuals who extort my clients. Furthermore, the debt is only one fraction of your current problem." Savannah swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously to the parchment in his hand. "What do you mean? What else is there?" Mr. Crawford adjusted his glasses and held the document up to the stage lights. "When your mother-in-law restructured her empire 6 months ago, she also updated her primary living trust. She included a very specific and highly punitive behavioral clause. Allow me to read it to you directly." He cleared his throat and began to read with absolute terrifying clarity. "Any heir beneficiary or legally recognized dependent who publicly humiliates me or who attempts to declare me mentally incompetent under false or fraudulent pretenses shall instantly and permanently forfeit their entire share of the liquid estate." Savannah froze, the blood draining completely from her lips. She stared at the microphone stand resting just a few feet away. "You stood on this stage 5 minutes ago," Mr. Crawford continued, pointing a stern finger at Savannah. "You and your husband used a live microphone to announce to 300 business associates that Josephine Crown was suffering from devastating Alzheimer's disease. You publicly humiliated her. You attempted to enforce a fraudulent medical retirement. By performing that exact sequence of actions in front of a room full of witnesses, you just triggered the punitive codicil. You and Kendrick are legally, permanently, and irrevocably disinherited from her $40 million fortune. You will not receive a single penny from the blind trust. You just actively threw away the only financial lifeline that could have saved you." The realization struck Savannah with a devastating physical force. She stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the hem of her expensive gown. She collapsed onto the stage floor, her hands covering her face as she let out a loud, wretched sob. She had thought she was sealing her victory when she took the microphone. Instead, she had just read her own financial obituary. Kendrick finally broke away from Reginald's weakened grip. He crawled across the polished wooden floor of the stage, completely abandoning the last remaining shreds of his pride and dignity. The man who had sneered at me in the bridal suite, the son who had told me my time was over, was now weeping openly on his hands and knees. He scrambled toward where I was standing, his breath coming in ragged, pathetic gasps. He reached out and grabbed the heavy emerald fabric of my custom evening gown, clinging to it like a drowning sailor clutching a life raft. "Mom, please," Kendrick sobbed, looking up at me with tears streaming down his face. "I am so sorry. I was desperate. The offshore lenders were threatening me. Reginald was pressuring me to fix the margin calls. I made a terrible mistake, but you cannot let them do this to me. You have to pay the banks. You have the cash inside the blind trust. You can clear the $45 million debt tomorrow morning. If you do not wire the funds, I will lose the mansion. I will lose the cars. I am going to end up with absolutely nothing. Please, Mom, I am your only son. You cannot let your own flesh and blood go bankrupt." I looked down at the weeping man clinging to my dress. I felt a profound, hollow sadness echoing in my chest, but there was absolutely zero pity in my heart. I remembered the cold, callous look in his eyes when he handed the bribe money to the medical thugs. I remembered him threatening to lock me inside a state-run psychiatric ward so he could steal the empire I had sacrificed my entire life to build. He did not care about my safety, my dignity, or my sanity. He only cared about saving himself. I calmly reached down and pried his trembling fingers off the silk fabric of my gown one by one. I stepped back, removing myself completely from his grasp. I looked directly into his terrified, tear-filled eyes, ensuring he heard every single syllable of my final response. "I do not remember authorizing any payments to cover your criminal debts," I said, my voice ice-cold and echoing powerfully across the silent ballroom. "I do not remember agreeing to bail out the man who tried to erase my existence. But then again, according to the public announcement you just made to 300 people, my mind is slipping. I suppose I am just a confused, failing old woman who cannot be trusted to manage complex financial transfers. Right?" Kendrick stared at me, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. He realized in that exact moment that the trap he had fallen into was inescapable. I turned my back on him, leaving him weeping on the floor of the country club, and walked away. Savannah did not stay on the floor for long. Desperation pulled her upright. She wiped at the mascara streaking beneath her eyes, grabbed the live microphone from the stand, and turned toward the ballroom with both hands wrapped around it. "Do not listen to her," she said. Her voice cracked at first, then strengthened as she saw that the crowd had not yet physically left. Josephine is manipulating all of you. This is exactly what the doctor warned us would happen. Confusion can present as paranoia. Patients can become convinced that their own family is plotting against them. She lifted the medical affidavit again. We have a diagnosis. We have a signed legal document. We have been trying to protect her. For a moment, the room entered that dangerous space where people wanted an easier explanation. A family medical crisis was easier to understand than bribery, extortion, forged loans, and a hostile corporate takeover. Savannah saw the hesitation and pressed harder. Ask yourselves what is more likely, she said. That an entire family, a respected neurologist, legal professionals, and business advisors all conspired against one woman, or that an elderly patient is refusing to accept her condition. She pointed at me. Look at how aggressive she has been tonight. Look at the accusations. Look at the drama. That is not stability. I did not interrupt her. I had learned long ago that the best way to expose a lie is sometimes to let it become complete. Savannah turned toward me. You broke a window to escape a room where people were trying to keep you safe. You stormed into a private announcement. You accused your own son of crimes. You are proving our case for us. Kendrick looked up from the floor. Hope flickered in his face. He seized the idea immediately. She is right, he said, scrambling to his feet. Mom, you are sick. You do not understand what you are doing. Everything we did was because you have been declining. The hypocrisy was almost elegant. Minutes earlier, he had begged me to pay $45 million because I was supposedly the only person capable of rescuing him. Now that rescue had been refused, I was incompetent again. I turned toward the rear balcony. Dante, I said. Every head in the ballroom followed my gaze. The door to the AV booth opened. My grandson stepped out with his tablet in one hand and his laptop tucked beneath his arm. He walked along the balcony rail without hurry, descended the side stairs, and entered the ballroom. The people who had dismissed him for years as a boy who played on computers watched him cross the room with the calm of someone who knew he controlled the most important evidence in the building. Savannah's face tightened. You had no right to access private systems. Dante stopped beside the stage. You mean the system recording the room where you threatened my grandmother with a sedative? The ballroom reacted instantly. Savannah tried to answer, but Dante tapped the screen. The giant projection panels behind us went black. Then an image appeared. It was the bridal suite. The camera angle was high and slightly wide, but the picture was sharp. Savannah stood beside the vanity. Reginald was near the locked door. Kendrick stood directly in front of me. The two men in medical scrubs were visible in the corner. One held the syringe. No explanation was necessary. A collective intake of breath moved through the audience. Savannah turned toward the screens as if she had been struck. Dante increased the volume. On the recording, my voice sounded frightened. And if I refuse Reginald's recorded answer filled the ballroom, then we proceed according to the medical recommendation. You are placed under supervision, emergency guardianship is requested, and Kendrick acts to preserve the company. Savannah reached for Dante's tablet. A security guard stepped between them before she could touch him. The footage continued. Recorded, Savannah said, you sign operational control and ownership right now, or we move you somewhere appropriate. Then the man in scrubs uncapped the syringe. Several guests audibly cursed. A woman near the front table covered her mouth. One investor stood so abruptly that his chair tipped backward. Kendrick rushed toward the projection system. Turn it off. Dante did not even look at him. The next segment played. On screen, I asked, did I see Dr. Thorne? I do not remember seeing him. Recorded, Kendrick laughed. Because I paid him, his voice boomed through the sound system. The ballroom became motionless. Dante froze the frame for half a second, then let it continue. $20,000 bought a diagnosis nobody in this city will challenge. Kendrick's face in the room turned gray. The recording continued. The dementia affidavit is leverage. I paid the doctor $20,000 to give us something legal enough to scare you and credible enough to use if you refused. There it was. Not my accusation. Not Dante's interpretation. Kendrick's own voice clear enough that nobody could pretend to misunderstand it. Savannah screamed, that recording is edited. Dante looked at her for the first time. It is time-stamped from the club's own security feed. The full, uncompressed file has already been preserved in multiple locations. She pointed wildly at the screen. You hacked it. That makes it illegal. Mr. Crawford stepped forward. You should spend less time improvising legal theories in front of witnesses. The crowd began to move, not toward the exits yet, but away from the Vances. The physical distance was subtle at first. Savannah's closest friend stepped backward. A business partner who had been seated beside Reginald picked up his phone and moved to another table. Two investors began speaking urgently to each other while staring at the footage. The social structure that had protected the Vances for years was collapsing in inches. Dante advanced the recording. Now Kendrick was discussing forged board notices. "Your signature was easy to replicate the recorded version of," my son said. "We created the paperwork required to make tonight look orderly." Someone in the room shouted, "Jesus." A man near the press table raised his phone and began recording the screen. Others followed. Within seconds, dozens of devices were pointed toward the stage. The Vances had wanted a room full of influential witnesses for their merger announcement. They now had a room full of influential witnesses documenting evidence of their crimes. Savannah tried one last time. Josephine knew this was happening. She staged all of it. I took the microphone from the stand. "Yes," I said. "I knew enough to walk into the room and let you show me exactly what you were willing to do. I did not buy the fake diagnosis. I did not hire the men with the syringe. I did not forge my signature. I did not borrow $45 million through offshore entities. And I did not force Kendrick to confess. I simply stopped saving him from the consequences of his own mouth." No one looked at Savannah anymore. I turned toward the audience. "Some of you applauded 10 minutes ago when my son announced that I could no longer feed or dress myself. I am not angry with you for believing a medical document. I am asking you to remember how easily that document replaced the living woman standing in front of you. They counted on my age doing half the work for them." The room stayed silent. They knew that if a 68-year-old woman became angry after being threatened, people might call her unstable. They knew that if I objected loudly, they could call it an episode. They knew that if I disappeared from the party, they could call it treatment. That was the weapon. Savannah's hand shook around the affidavit. I looked directly at her. "You told these people I could not dress myself. Then you threatened to have me sedated because I understood a 50-page corporate transfer too well." A few people nodded. I pointed to the screen. "That is not dementia. That is evidence." Dante changed the display again. A timeline appeared showing the payment to Dr. Thorne, the forged documents, and the offshore loan trails already discussed on stage. He did not reveal anything outside the plot we had already uncovered. He simply placed the pieces where the room could see them together. The effect was devastating. What had sounded complicated when spoken aloud became a straight line from motive to fraud to coercion. Reginald began scanning the exits. I noticed. So did Dante. But I kept speaking. "You wanted society to believe I was disposable because I was old," I said. "You wanted investors to believe my company needed rescuing because I was confused. You wanted my own family to believe that stealing from me was succession planning. Now everyone in this room has heard what you say when you think the old woman cannot fight back." The final clip began. Kendrick's recorded voice said, "Your time is over, Mom. It is my empire now." The screen froze on his face. The silence afterward was heavier than any applause. Then the room erupted. Guests began talking all at once. Investors demanded answers. Phones rang. Someone near Reginald's table said he was calling his attorney. Another person shouted that Vance Capital's partners needed to freeze transfers immediately. Savannah's friends moved away from her as though proximity itself had become dangerous. The people who had treated her family name as a social passport were now calculating how quickly they could prove they had never been close. Kendrick stood in the center of the stage, looking from the screen to me, then to the crowd. His social world had been reduced to ashes in less than a minute. Savannah dropped the fake affidavit. It slid across the stage and stopped near my shoe. I bent down, picked it up, and held it between two fingers. $20,000, I said. "That is what you thought my mind was worth." Then I tore the paper once down the center and let both halves fall. Behind me, the screen still glowed with the frozen image of Kendrick's confession. Across the ballroom, Reginald grabbed his wife's wrist and began moving toward the catering doors. The enormous ballroom screens were still glowing brightly behind the main stage. They illuminated the absolute destruction of my son's carefully constructed facade. The undeniable audio of Kendrick bribing the corrupt doctor continued to ring in the ears of the 300 horrified guests. Reginald Vance did not waste a single second watching his son-in-law weep on the polished hardwood floor. The patriarch of the Vance family was a seasoned corporate predator who recognized a fatal checkmate the instant it was played. He understood with terrifying clarity that the digital evidence Dante had just broadcast to the entire room was more than enough to secure multiple federal indictments. Reginald slowly backed away from the edge of the stage. He carefully positioned himself behind a cluster of stunned socialites who were busy frantically texting their wealth managers. He reached out and grabbed his wife's wrist with a vice-like grip. He leaned in close to her ear, his face pale and completely devoid of its usual aristocratic arrogance. He ordered her to keep her mouth shut, leave her purse on the table, and walk toward the kitchen service doors as casually as possible. He explained in a harsh whisper that they needed to reach their private car and drive straight to the international terminal at the airport before the authorities processed the magnitude of the wire fraud. He knew his signature was all over the collateral documents for the $45 million offshore loans. He knew his failing private equity firm was inextricably linked to Kendrick's criminal embezzlement scheme. Reginald planned to abandon his daughter Savannah to face the catastrophic fallout alone. He intended to slip out through the service exit board, a red-eye flight to a country without an extradition treaty, and salvage whatever hidden assets he had left. He shoved his wife forward using the chaotic, murmuring crowd as a human shield. They navigated past the melting ice sculpture and the abandoned champagne flutes moving with the desperate, quiet urgency of cornered animals. They reached the heavy swinging doors that separated the lavish ballroom from the busy catering kitchen. Reginald pushed the door open slightly, the harsh fluorescent light spilling out onto the patterned carpet. He thought he had successfully outsmarted the system one final time. He believed his old money connections and his instinct for self-preservation had provided him a narrow avenue of escape. He took a deep breath, preparing to vanish into the night and leave his family to burn in the fire he had helped ignite. He stepped through the doorway, fully expecting to see a clear path to the loading dock. Instead, he collided squarely with a solid wall of dark, heavy tactical body armor. The impact knocked the wind completely out of his lungs. He stumbled backward, his polished leather shoes slipping awkwardly on the pristine marble transition strip. His wife let out a muffled gasp of pure terror, dropping her diamond-studded clutch onto the floor. The heavy brass doors swung wide open, revealing the absolute collapse of his desperate escape plan. The reality of his complete financial and personal ruin was standing right in front of him, blocking the only available exit from the building. He was completely trapped. The heavy swinging doors of the catering kitchen did not just open, they were shoved violently backward with an explosive, concussive force that sent Reginald staggering into a row of stainless steel prep tables. 6 federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation marched through the service entrance. They moved in perfect, highly trained synchronization. They were dressed in dark windbreakers with bold yellow lettering across their backs. They bypassed the terrified catering staff who dropped their silver serving trays in shock. The lead agent, a tall, imposing man with a stern face and absolute authority, stepped directly over the shattered glass on the kitchen floor. He did not ask for permission to enter the premises. Dante had forwarded the comprehensive offshore wire fraud evidence, the forged corporate transfer documents, and the unedited extortion video directly to the local field office 2 hours ago. The authorities had been sitting quietly in unmarked vehicles at the perimeter of the Buckhead Country Club, waiting patiently for the exact moment the trap was fully sprung. They marched past Reginald without breaking stride, pushing through the double doors and flooding into the grand ballroom. The sudden, overwhelming presence of federal law enforcement officers caused the murmuring crowd of elite investors and high society guests to fall into a dead, terrified silence. The jazz quartet stopped playing mid-measure. The agents fanned out across the room, securing every exit and locking down the entire facility. They moved with swift, calculated precision, cutting through the sea of expensive evening gowns and tailored tuxedos. The lead agent walked straight down the center aisle, his eyes locked on the stage where Kendrick was still kneeling in a pathetic heap of ruined ambition. Dante stood calmly beside me, his hands resting lightly on his laptop bag, watching the inevitable culmination of his brilliant digital snare. The raid was entirely bloodless, but completely devastating in its execution. The authorities did not need to draw weapons or shout commands. Their mere presence in the epicenter of Atlanta's most exclusive country club was the ultimate declaration of absolute defeat for the Vance family. The guests backed away, clearing a wide path for the agents eager to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of a massive corporate scandal. The elite socialites who had spent the entire evening mocking my working-class background were now holding their collective breath, watching in stunned fascination as the federal government dismantled a criminal syndicate disguised as a wealthy family. The lead agent ascended the velvet-lined stairs to the main stage, his heavy boots echoing in the quiet ballroom. He pulled a pair of steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. The metallic clinking sound cut through the tension like a physical blade. The raid was the undeniable consequence of greed, and there was absolutely nowhere left to run. The entire operation unfolded with absolute perfection, leaving no room for any further manipulation or deceit. The lead agent stopped directly in front of Kendrick. He looked down at my son, who was still clutching the hem of my custom emerald gown in a desperate final plea for salvation. The agent did not offer any sympathy. He calmly stated Kendrick's full legal name, his voice projecting clearly across the silent room. He announced that Kendrick was officially under arrest for multiple federal offenses, including conspiracy to commit wire fraud, massive corporate embezzlement, and the attempted extortion and elder abuse of Josephine Crown. The agent ordered Kendrick to release my dress and place his hands behind his back. Kendrick seemed completely paralyzed by the reality of his situation. He stared blankly at the silver handcuffs, his mind unable to process the total collapse of his entire world. The agent did not wait for compliance. He firmly grabbed Kendrick's right arm, twisting it behind his back with practiced efficiency, and snapped the cold steel cuff around his wrist. Savannah let out a blood-curdling, hysterical scream. She lunged across the stage, her high heels slipping on the polished wood. She grabbed the agent's shoulder frantically, trying to pull him away from her husband. She shrieked that there had been a terrible misunderstanding, that they were members of the most prestigious country club in the city, and that people of their social standing simply did not go to jail. A second federal agent immediately intercepted her. He caught her wrists mid-swing, spinning her around and pinning her arms together. Savannah thrashed wildly against his grip, her expensive diamond tennis bracelet catching on his uniform. She sobbed uncontrollably, mascara running down her face in dark, messy streaks. She screamed that she was old money, that her father would call the governor, and that she demanded to speak to her attorney right this instant. The agent calmly ignored her hysterical demands and locked a second pair of handcuffs around her wrists. Her $10,000 designer gown tore at the shoulder seam as she continued to fight against the inevitable. Back at the kitchen doors, two other agents were currently securing Reginald Vance. The proud, arrogant patriarch who had tried to flee the country was now pressed flat against the wall, his hands firmly restrained behind his back. His wife was hyperventilating near the dessert station, surrounded by officers who were reading her the Miranda rights. The entire Vance family, the very people who had plotted to throw me into a state-run psychiatric ward, were now chained together in front of the entire Atlanta business community. The arrest was not just a legal procedure, it was a complete and total social execution. The guests watched in absolute mesmerized horror as the prominent couple was physically restrained. The illusion of their untouchable wealth was shattered permanently, replaced by the stark, humiliating reality of federal custody. Savannah continued to wail, her cries echoing painfully through the grand ballroom, but nobody stepped forward to help her. Her elite friends simply turned their faces away, severing their ties instantly. The lead agent hauled Kendrick firmly to his feet. My son swayed unsteadily, his knees buckling under the crushing weight of his ruined life. He looked completely broken, stripped of all the arrogant pride and cruel entitlement that had fueled his treacherous scheme. The agent began to guide him toward the edge of the stage, preparing to escort him through the sea of disgusted guests and out to the waiting transport vehicles. As they moved toward the stairs, Kendrick planted his feet and resisted the pull. He turned his head back toward me one last time. His face was a mask of absolute agonizing desperation. His eyes pleaded for a miracle that he had violently refused to give me when he locked me in the bridal suite. "Mom, please." Kendrick choked out, his voice cracking into a pathetic, ragged sob. "Please help me. I am your son. You cannot let them take me away. I will lose everything. I will die in there. Please, you have to save me." I stood perfectly still in the center of the stage. The bright chandeliers illuminated every detail of my face. I did not step forward to comfort him. I did not shed a single tear. I looked down at the man who had willingly paid a corrupt doctor to erase my mind and steal the legacy I had built from nothing. I remembered the cold, callous expression he wore when he handed the bribe money to the medical thugs. I remembered him threatening to lock me in an asylum just to impress his bankrupt, snobbish in-laws. I drew upon the formidable strength that had allowed me to survive 40 years of ruthless corporate battles. I looked him dead in the eye, ensuring that my final message would echo in his mind for every single day of his federal sentence. "You stopped being my son the moment you decided my life was disposable," I stated. My voice was incredibly calm, resolute, and harder than diamond. "I handed you an empire and you tried to bury me for it. You made your choice, Kendrick. Now you will sit in a cage and live with it." I turned my back on him entirely, facing Dante instead. The federal agent yanked Kendrick forward, ignoring his continued desperate sobbing. The officers marched Kendrick, Savannah, and Reginald down the center aisle of the ballroom. The 300 guests parted in absolute silence, watching the disgraced family being dragged out through the grand lobby. The heavy brass doors slammed shut behind them, sealing their fate. I reached out and gently placed my hand on Dante's shoulder. My grandson looked at me with deep, unwavering respect. The toxic poison that had infected my family was finally gone, surgically removed by the very boy they had always underestimated. The empire was safe, and the crown remained exactly where it belonged. "Let us go home, Dante," I said softly. "We have a company to run tomorrow morning." The morning sun rose over the Atlanta skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across the concrete steps of the federal courthouse. I did not attend the initial arraignment hearings for Kendrick, Savannah, or Reginald. I sent Mr. Crawford in my place to observe the legal slaughter from the back row of the gallery. The federal prosecutors did not waste time with grandstanding. They presented the airtight digital evidence Dante had captured, dropping a mountain of intercepted wire transfers, offshore banking logs, and the high-definition extortion video directly onto the judge's desk. The presiding magistrate took one look at the sheer volume of premeditated criminal activity and immediately revoked their passports. He deemed all three of them severe flight risks, categorically denying bail. The reality of their situation hit them instantly. They were strip-searched, processed, and locked in federal holding cells while awaiting trial. The pristine, untouchable veneer of the Vance family was entirely dismantled within 48 hours. Reginald's private equity firm collapsed the very next business day. The federal banks aggressively called in their massive loans, freezing all corporate and personal assets associated with his name. His wife was forced to vacate their sprawling Alpharetta estate with nothing but a single suitcase of clothing. She moved into a cheap extended-stay motel on the outskirts of the city, utterly destitute and completely abandoned by the high society friends she had spent decades cultivating. Over the next 8 months, the legal proceedings moved with lethal efficiency. The prosecution offered them a brutal choice. They could take the case to a jury trial and face a guaranteed 20-year sentence for conspiracy, wire fraud, and elder abuse, or they could plead guilty immediately. Kendrick and Savannah folded under the pressure. Their arrogance cracked under the bleak, terrifying reality of a concrete cell. They both signed comprehensive plea agreements. The judge sentenced my son and my former daughter-in-law to 8 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. The elite socialites who had mocked my working-class background spent their days trading gossip about the spectacular downfall of the Vance family. The high society circles completely erased their names from every country club registry and charity board in the state. They became a cautionary tale, a whispered warning about the devastating consequences of extreme greed. What surprised me most during those 8 months was not how quickly the Vances lost their invitations, their memberships, or their public reputation. It was how quickly people who had once treated me as the embarrassing outsider began pretending they had always respected me. I received flowers from women who had laughed at Savannah's comments. I received calls from executives who suddenly remembered that they had admired my company for years. I accepted none of their revised history. I did not need apologies manufactured by fear. I needed distance from the culture that had made Kendrick believe status could replace character. I also refused to turn the criminal case into a second career. Mr. Crawford kept me informed. Dante assisted when investigators needed technical explanations of the records he had preserved. I gave sworn statements, produced documents, and then returned to work. Kendrick sent letters from custody. The first ones were angry. He blamed Reginald, Savannah, the lenders, Dante, and finally me. Later, the letters became apologetic. He wrote about childhood sacrifices he suddenly remembered with perfect clarity now that he needed mercy. I read each letter once. I did not answer. Forgiveness, if it ever came, would not be the same thing as rescue. He had asked me to choose his future over my freedom. I had finally chosen my own. Dante struggled more quietly. Kendrick was his father, and victory did not erase that fact. One evening after a long meeting, he admitted that part of him still expected his father to walk through the office door and criticize his clothes, his career, or the way he spent his time. I told him that being underestimated can become a prison if you spend your whole life trying to prove the person wrong. Do not build your future as an argument with your father, I said. Build it because it belongs to you. He listened. That mattered to me more than any balance sheet. By the time the plea agreements were final, the company had stabilized completely. Vendors who had heard rumors during the party stayed because our contracts were secure. Employees received a direct explanation that ownership of the real operating assets had never changed. No factory closed. No payroll was missed. The disaster Kendrick intended to use as proof that I was too old to lead became proof that careful preparation mattered more than appearance. I did not preserve the company so I could sit forever at the head of every table. I preserved it so succession would happen by choice, competence and trust, not by coercion. With their criminal convictions officially finalized, the federal banks moved swiftly to recover the massive debts Kendrick had legally accepted when he forced me to sign over the empty operational shell. The foreclosure proceedings on his Buckhead mansion were executed in a matter of weeks. The bank listed the sprawling multi-million-dollar property at a public county auction. I attended the auction on a crisp Tuesday morning, standing quietly at the back of the municipal plaza while wealthy developers and real estate flippers gathered to bid on the luxurious estate. I waited patiently as the auctioneer rattled off the opening numbers, letting the eager crowd drive the price up. Just as the gavel was about to fall on a rival bid, Mr. Crawford raised his numbered paddle. I purchased the foreclosed mansion in cash for absolute pennies on the dollar, legally acquiring the very home my son had bought using my stolen dividends. I did not keep the property. I hired a premier liquidation firm to completely gut the interior. A crew of professional movers spent 3 days carrying out Savannah's custom-imported Italian furniture, her massive collection of designer shoes, and every piece of expensive modern art hanging on the walls. The liquidation company auctioned the contents of the house, generating hundreds of thousands of dollars in pure profit. I ordered the contractors to rip out the custom marble countertops and the imported hardwood floors, stripping the house down to its bare structural studs. I sold the empty property to a commercial developer who planned to bulldoze the structure and build a subdivision. I took the massive check generated from the property sale and the interior liquidation and drove straight to downtown Atlanta. I walked into the administrative office of a heavily underfunded battered women's shelter, a sanctuary that provided legal protection and housing for women escaping severe domestic and financial abuse. I placed the certified bank draft directly onto the director's desk. The woman stared at the string of zeros, her eyes welling with tears as she realized the donation would fully fund their operations for the next decade. I turned the opulent stolen wealth of an arrogant, abusive family into a permanent shield for women who actually needed protection. The poetic justice felt infinitely more satisfying than any luxury car or diamond necklace ever could. I walked out of the shelter, feeling a profound sense of closure, ready to permanently close the door on the past and focus entirely on the future. The Monday after the final financial restrictions were lifted, Mr. Crawford and I unfroze the blind trust that held the real business. We completed the filings required to move the operating assets into a newly protected corporate structure, updated the internal controls, and made sure no single executive could ever again reach the company's most important accounts without independent review. I did not rebuild because the old company had failed. I rebuilt because betrayal had revealed exactly where its defenses needed to become stronger. Then I called a board meeting. The 12 directors gathered around the long mahogany table in my downtown Atlanta office, expecting a speech about recovery. Instead, I told them recovery was not enough. A company that survives an attack and learns nothing from it is only waiting for the next attack, I said. We are going to become better because they tried to break us. I announced Dante as Vice President of Operations. The glass doors opened, and my grandson walked in wearing a black hoodie, dark jeans, and clean sneakers. He carried one laptop and no interest in performing wealth for anyone. A few directors looked surprised. None objected. They knew what he had done. More importantly, I explained what his role would actually be. Dante was not receiving a title because he was my grandson. He was receiving responsibility because he had demonstrated judgment under pressure, protected evidence when everyone around him was panicking, and understood the digital systems on which our modern supply chain depended. Dante connected his computer to the presentation screen and laid out a complete operational security overhaul. Financial approvals would require layered authentication. Vendor changes would trigger independent verification. Sensitive contracts would be mirrored into tamper-resistant archives. Access logs would be reviewed by people outside the department being audited. He also proposed cross-training younger technical staff with older operations managers so that institutional memory and modern cybersecurity would reinforce each other instead of competing. I watched the board listen to him. For years, Kendrick had treated authority as something attached to a suit, a surname, or a country club table. Dante treated authority as the result of knowing what needed to be done and doing it well. That difference was why one of them had tried to inherit an empire by force, while the other had earned a seat beside me. In the months that followed, our margins improved, but that was not the number I cared about most. Employee retention rose, vendor disputes fell, fraud alerts became faster. The company expanded into new markets without surrendering the discipline that had built it. Dante still wore hoodies to many meetings. Nobody cared. When he spoke, people listened because his ideas survived scrutiny. I kept my office. I kept working. But I no longer confused leadership with refusing to share power. My mistake with Kendrick had been giving him resources before he had earned responsibility. With Dante, I did the opposite. I gave him responsibility first and let trust grow from what he did with it. That was the kind of succession I had always wanted, even if it took the worst night of my family's life to teach me how to build it. 3 months after Dante took the new role, we held our first company-wide operations meeting inside the largest Atlanta distribution center. I chose that location deliberately. I did not want our recovery story told only from a polished boardroom. Hundreds of employees stood between stacked pallets loading lanes and the machinery that moved our products across the country. Many had heard fragments of the scandal. Some had worried that the merger announcement meant layoffs or a sale. I stood on a small platform with Dante beside me and told them the simplest truth: the company had never belonged to the people who tried to steal it, and it would not be run as a family toy. I explained the new controls, the stronger protections, and the promotion structure we were building for people who actually contributed to the business. Dante spoke after me. He did not mention what his parents had called him or how often they had dismissed his work. He talked about systems accountability and making sure no employee would ever wake up to discover that a secret financial scheme had endangered the place where they earned their living. That was when I knew he had understood what I hoped to teach him. Leadership was not revenge performed from a higher chair. It was responsibility widened to include people who could not protect themselves from decisions made above them. After the meeting, I walked through the warehouse without an entourage. The smell of cardboard oils and machinery took me back to the earliest years of the company, but I did not stop to romanticize hardship. I had not built the business so future generations could worship my struggle. I had built it so they would have choices I never had. The lesson Kendrick missed was that inheritance is not permission to consume what someone else sacrificed to create. It is an obligation to protect it, improve it, and leave something useful behind. Dante understood that. For the first time, I could imagine stepping away one day without feeling that stepping away meant disappearing. There was a difference between being pushed aside and choosing to make room. Kendrick had tried to erase me so he could take my place. Dante earned my trust by never asking me to vanish. I also changed the way I handled family money. No more silent rescues, no more accounts opened simply because someone shared my blood, and no more assumption that love required unlimited access. Every future benefit connected to the trust would be tied to transparent responsibilities and independent oversight. Some people might call that cold. I called it clarity. Wealth had not created Kendrick's character, but my willingness to shield him from consequences had allowed that character to grow without resistance. The change brought me an unexpected freedom. I no longer spent evenings wondering whether saying no made me a bad mother. I no longer treated boundaries as punishment. A boundary was simply a locked door around something valuable, and every successful factory bank account and computer network I had ever managed depended on good locks. Families should not require fewer protections than business when trust has already been abused. Dante never asked me how much he would inherit. He asked what he needed to learn next. That question told me more about his readiness than any promise could have. I began teaching him the parts of the company that could not be downloaded from a server, how to read a supplier's hesitation, how to know when a cheap contract will become an expensive mistake, how to remember the employees whose names never appear in executive presentations. He taught me what I had ignored for too long about digital risk. We became stronger because neither of us had to pretend the other generation was useless. I am 68 years old. Society conditions older women to believe that our best years are behind us. We are consistently told to shrink, to quiet down, to politely step aside, and let the younger generations take the reins. We are expected to retire gracefully to quiet gardens and let our life's work be managed by people who never had to bleed for it. The world assumes that because our hair turns silver and our steps slow down, our minds have gone soft. They mistake our cultivated patience for weakness. They assume that our desire for family peace means we will tolerate extreme disrespect. Kendrick and his elite in-laws made that exact fatal miscalculation. They looked at a woman who had survived 4 decades of brutal, unforgiving commercial warfare and saw nothing but an easy target. They tried to build a cage for a lioness, entirely forgetting that I was the one who taught them how to hunt. They believed they could steal my crown by simply forcing me to sign a piece of paper. But a true queen never actually takes off her crown. She simply changes who she allows to sit at her table. I removed the toxic, greedy elements from my life with surgical precision. I protected the grandson who proved his absolute loyalty, elevating him to the highest levels of success. I reclaimed my empire, fortified my legacy, and ensured that my wealth would be used to build a stronger future entirely on my own uncompromising terms. My hands may show the wrinkles of time, but they remain perfectly steady when holding a pen, and even steadier when tearing down the very people who try to destroy me. So, that is my story. I would love to hear what you think. Was I too ruthless for letting my own son inherit $45 million in toxic debt and go to a federal prison, or did he get exactly the anniversary present he deserved? Let me know in the comments and subscribe for more stories like mine.